Right? These videos are going to be talking about the civil rights movement, so we're going to be going through chapter 28 of our textbook. The first thing we need to discuss is why the post-World War II period provided a ripe climate for the civil rights movement. So in some ways, let's talk continuity and change first. If you recall, after World War I, we saw a similar phenomenon. Black soldiers enlisted in pretty big numbers because they felt as though their service to the country might warrant more equal treatment once they returned home. But what we experienced after World War I was that they don't really get this better treatment, right? We know that when they were in Europe even, they tended to be treated with more tolerance and respect. For example, black soldiers in France felt that way. And then they come home, and in the 1920s, we even see a revival of the Ku Klux Klan. So the same kind of mentality exists after World War II. During the war, if you recall, many black soldiers campaigned for what they called the double V, the double victory. They believed that they could both defeat the Nazis abroad and then come home and defeat racism. And so there's that sense of the desire for reward after military service. You also, just in general, because of shifting economic patterns and high demands for labor during the war, you saw a continuation of the black migration during the World War II era. So this map demonstrates to us the states that gained a significant black population during the war, and you can see that many of them exist in the Northeast and the Midwest. And what they're going to experience when they move to these places is that even though these states don't have Jim Crow segregation, so they don't have segregation by law or de jure segregation, they do have what we call de facto segregation, which means that even if it's not law, economic and social conditions and just the undercurrent of racism does essentially segregate black and white still. And so that realization gives a further push for African Americans to move more towards their equality. You did see some progress by the federal government. For example, in 1948, Truman integrated the armed forces. So when the U.S. enters Korea, there are integrated military units for the first time. Now, this, of course, does not mean that racism is over in the armed forces, but at least it does mean that the government is attempting to integrate black and white together. You do see that there's an adverse reaction to this integration, that some Democrats are very opposed to this. And so there is sort of a split that occurs in the Democratic Party. And one could argue that this is one of the reasons why Harry Truman loses popularity in addition to his lack of success in Korea. And we could accredit this shift in the Democratic Party to Eisenhower's victory in 1952. Another thing that we see is that the NAACP, or the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, is going to grow pretty substantially. And I just wanted to show you a animated map really briefly to get a sense of that growth. All right, so in the earliest years of the NAACP, so if I scroll this little guy backwards a little bit, there were only 3 branches of the NAACP, right, in major northern cities. But as we advance this map, we start to see that pretty rapidly the NAACP is going to grow. During the World War I era, we see it growing pretty substantially in the Midwest and Northeast, as well as a couple of places in the South and West. Let's see if I can zoom out so we can see the whole country. There we go. Better. And then you really, really see the NAACP rapidly grow if I just advance a little bit faster. So by the time we get to the World War II era, so let me go a little bit faster here. Okay, so here we are in 1942, in the middle of World War II, and we see that the NAACP is incredibly popular. It's also reflecting some of the black migration patterns. And by the time we get to the actual civil rights movement in earnest, there are NAACP chapters all over the country, except in areas where there is not a substantial black population. So that's definitely a significant shift there. Another thing that we see happening that contributes to the growth of the civil rights movement is that there are going to be black figures in the United States that start to shatter the racial glass ceiling. So in other words, they start to sort of they start to incorporate themselves into positions of power that were not previously held by blacks. And they prove that African Americans have just as much of a place in those positions as their white counterparts. So in terms of sports, we have Jackie Robinson join the Major League. He was a deliberate choice by the Major League. There were other actually more talented players that were considered to be the first black players in baseball, or in Major League Baseball rather. But Jackie Robinson was seen as a sort of a more moderate figure who would tolerate the sense of racial tension that he would experience as he traveled around the country competing. And then also in terms of the political front, you have a black recipient of the Nobel Peace Prize in 1950. His name was Ralph Bunche. We see the newspaper article here. What he did was he mediated in the Arab-Israeli conflict and was awarded with the Nobel Peace Prize. And so the general public starts to realize that black people are able to achieve the same kind of immense accomplishments as white people. And so there is going to be, again, a little bit of a shift in the public attitude towards African Americans. And also in terms of pop culture, we have the incorporation of something called bebop music. Now, the jazz or popular music of the 1940s was something called big band. So I actually want to do a little bit of a listen to see if you can tell the difference between these two musical styles. So big band, it is sort of what it sounds like. There was a pretty, large band that would accompany the singer and the main instrumentalist. And it was very danceable popular music. So we're just going to listen to just a few moments of this song. You'll probably recognize it. Okay, I think you get the point there. So that is an example of big band. And then I want to give you an example of bebop. This is Dizzy Gillespie. He was a black artist. By the way, Benny Goodman was white. And what we see with bebop is that it is a little bit less danceable. The music was harder to replicate by mainstream white artists. If you remember from the our previous look at sort of race and music, we looked at how a lot of white artists would cover black hits like Pat Boone covering Little Richard, for example. This was a harder type of music for mainstream white people to emulate. And this shows us in bebop that a lot of these artists are refusing to cater towards white norms. So Dizzy Gillespie, Miles Davis, Thelonious Monk, they're all really good examples of bebop artists. So just a moment listening to this song, listen to the difference between this and the previous song. So again, it's definitely not something that is danceable and not something that's necessarily pleasing to the mainstream white audience. So it does show us that African American artists are also less willing to sort of conform to white tastes in order to, become famous. In terms of the origins of integration, the monumental Supreme Court case of Brown versus Board of 1954 sort of kicks off some of the major political decisions that ultimately are going to lead towards desegregation. So the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, he was newly appointed. His name was Earl Warren. So we refer to this court as the Warren Court. He was one of the most influential Supreme Court justices in history. Many historians compare him to John Marshall. You may remember him as the fourth Supreme Court justice. He was the one who tried to fight against Indian removal, right? But then Andrew Jackson ended up pushing back, and Indian removal happened anyway. So Earl Warren, his agenda for the Supreme Court increasingly focused on protecting individual rights. And so Brown v. Board is not the only decision that we see really majorly changing, the lives of African Americans in the country. So the Plessy versus Ferguson case of 1896 ruled that facilities could be separate so long as they were equal. You should remember that, because what Brown v. Board does is it overturns the Plessy decision. You remember that the only way you can get rid of a Supreme Court decision is with another one. So this is significant because this was an over 50-year period where the court was actually upholding essentially segregation and Jim Crow. So this was a unanimous decision, which is also significant. But one of the problems is that the decision is one thing, but actually implementing it is quite another. So the court did not really offer a clear timeline for implementing the Brown decision, and Southern whites were very clear that they had no intention of following the Brown decision. Many political leaders in the South actually got together and signed this document that they called it the Southern Manifesto. And what that said was that they were going to refuse to implement Brown versus Board, and they argued that the Brown versus Board decision was an abuse of judicial power. And so what we're going to see is that there's going to be a lot of a struggle between the federal government and state governments in order to actually carry out desegregation. Some white schools even separated their public schools and established white-only private schools on public school grounds. And one of the best examples of racial integration that we see sort of highlighting this battle between state and federal governments is the Little Rock integration. You see, this is a picture of one of the students trying to go to Little Rock High, and you see that there are these white bystanders that are essentially yelling at her, harassing her, trying to prevent her from going to school. What we have is that the governor of Arkansas actually employs the Arkansas Guard to try to prevent these students from getting into school. So again, the state has no intention of actually enforcing the Brown decision. The troops are eventually withdrawn, and then there's going to be riots against these school children. So Eisenhower decides that he needs to do something to make sure that this court decision is upheld. And so he sends in more troops to ensure, federal troops this time, to ensure that the school is integrated. So this is interesting because Eisenhower was not really an open proponent of civil rights, but you do see his respect for the federal court's decision by sending in troops to protect these students. So he felt like he had a duty to uphold federal authority. And this also is an important precedent because Eisenhower was the first president since Reconstruction to use federal troops to support civil rights. So that sort of gets us started with the political background, but also we should think about the social organization that led to the very well-orchestrated and organized civil rights movement. And so the watershed moment we normally point to for the civil rights movement was Rosa Parks on the bus, right? So basically, buses were segregated in the South, and white passengers were supposed to sit in the front, black passengers were supposed to sit in the back, and if the bus was crowded, then black passengers were supposed to give up their seats for white passengers. Rosa Parks got off a long shift from work and refused to get up when a white passenger wanted her seat. She was arrested for violating a segregation law. So obviously this is something that draws the attention of many civil rights activists because Rosa Parks was acting, she was not doing anything violent or aggressive. She just was simply tired and did not want to get up. And so Dr. Martin Luther King is going to get together and organize the Montgomery bus boycott. So essentially what that did was people who supported Rosa Parks and civil rights refused to use the Montgomery bus system. They organized carpools, some of them walked to work. And what happened was that the bus system experienced enough economic hardship that they eventually do end up integrating the buses. So this is a significant victory that also shows us that a sort of grassroots and also just socially oriented movement can result in success. And it also puts Martin Luther King on the map as a major civil rights leader. Martin Luther King was motivated both by his Christian upbringing. He was a well-educated son of a Baptist minister. He often accredited the use of nonviolence to Jesus Christ. And he also is very much drawn to the Indian independence movement that led to India's independence in 1947. And that was led by Gandhi, who also was a major proponent of nonviolent resistance. So it's important for us to realize that there's sort of a global component in the civil rights movement as well as a Christian one. And Dr. King forms the first civil rights organization called the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, or the SCLC, which deliberately promoted nonviolent direct action to challenge segregation. And so the idea was for these activists to actually directly confront segregation, face the possibility of arrest, but the idea was to grant more exposure to these civil rights atrocities to, gain more attention. So one of the most effective early methods to advance civil rights was sit-ins. And they originated in 1960. The first sit-in was held by African-American college students in Greensboro, North Carolina. They sat at segregated lunch counters in a Woolworth's store. And so they just tried to order their lunch, and they did so very politely, but they were refused service. This, at first, is just a few students, but eventually supporters, both black and white. You can see that this sit-in supporter was white, right? More and more people started to join in support of these sit-ins. But then you see all these people behind them are antagonizing them or against them, or pouring food on them, and oftentimes harassing them for their efforts to promote desegregation. So the sit-ins were equally effective in drawing sort of a white backlash, but also drawing support. They were widely supported by the African-American community. And just like the Montgomery bus boycott, people started to boycott businesses that would refuse to integrate their facilities to both black and white. So the boycotts, just like the bus boycotts, deeply cut into the pockets of many businessmen, and Woolworth's, the location of the first sit-in, was integrated by July of 1960. So it's just a number of months that the integration starts to take place. And there are going to be sit-ins and subsequent desegregations of many other public spaces throughout the South. One of the largest success stories of integration was in Atlanta, Georgia, which was the largest city in the South. And another civil rights organization is going to be created around this time. It was called the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, or SNCC. And it was a collaboration of both black and white supporters of civil rights, as you can see by their logo here. And again, just like the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, their goal was to support civil rights through nonviolent but direct confrontational action. And it's also important for us to realize that the leaders of the civil rights movement were often young students, very much confronting that sort of torn mentality during the 1950s, where they didn't really feel like they conformed to the baby boomer generation, and kind of felt a sense of rebelliousness, right? The 60s, we're going to see a major proliferation of civil rights. It's going to start to transition more into the political arena. We're going to see major civil rights legislation passed in the mid-1960s as well. And so by the 1960 election, we're going to see that civil rights is a discussion that was sort of underplayed, partly because neither presidential candidate, Nixon or JFK, really wanted to alienate their Southern white voters. So Nixon, interestingly, when he was vice president under Eisenhower, he supported civil rights. He was totally behind Eisenhower when he sent federal troops to help integrate the Little Rock school system, for example. But Kennedy gained a slightly stronger reputation for supporting civil rights by working with his brother, Robert Kennedy, who you see down here, to release Martin Luther King from jail at one point. So like I said earlier, Nixon sort of de-emphasizes some support for civil rights in his 1960 campaign. And even Kennedy himself does not really overtly want to alienate his white Southern voters. Black voters supported Kennedy much more, and one could say that black voters provided Kennedy's margin of victory. We know that ever since the Great Depression, black voters were leaning more and more towards the Democratic Party. We're going to see that even though JFK does not radically push the civil rights agenda at first in his presidency, he becomes more active as time goes on in pursuing school desegregation. Like, he sends the National Guard also into schools just like Eisenhower did. And most notably, he stood up against the governor of Alabama, George Wallace, who tried to step in and stop integration. So we do see that he becomes more active. And one of his most significant decisions in terms of promoting civil rights to the federal court was the appointment of the first African-American Supreme Court Justice, Thurgood Marshall. He appointed his brother as Attorney General, Robert Kennedy, and Kennedy uses the Justice Department to force compliance with desegregation orders. The Congress of Racial Equality, or CORE, is yet another civil rights organization that is formed in the 1960s. And this one sponsored what were called freedom rides. And these were biracial bus rides down to the Deep South. And their goal was to work to register African Americans to vote and to desegregate public spaces. Despite the fact that you see these very happy and ambitious people getting ready for their rides to the South, when they arrived there, they met a lot of violence, right? Some people firebombed the buses. You see this picture of a bus burning down here. They also sometimes would confront and beat the riders. And these were students. These were young, very ambitious people who were met by sometimes older and very angry white Southerners. The FBI and the Justice Department actually knew that there were plans for violence against the Freedom Riders, but they were not really there when the mob started. So again, there's sort of this sense of complacency and ignoring of the major civil rights issue. So there's certainly room for progress here. The fact that there was not very much police protection at first showed us that the political institutions in the South really felt that the Freedom Riders were troublemakers, right? They did not want them into their cities. And sometimes the police actually would actively act against the Freedom Riders. When the news of the Freedom Riders, especially the violence against them, hit the main stage, it also spread to international audiences. People in Europe were reading about the Freedom Rides. And this makes them very upset. They start to accuse the U.S. of being hypocritical because, again, with their Cold War mentality, they're promoting democracy. But it seems like for African Americans, democracy is not reality yet. So we do see that Kennedy steps in and tries to help the Freedom Riders. He starts to work to mediate safer conduct for the riders by incorporating the Justice Department. He gets the Justice Department to petition to establish new rules that effectively end segregated interstate buses. And he also gets the Interstate Commerce Commission involved to prevent segregation on interstate vehicles. So what this shows us is that the federal government intervention is really necessary to promote segregation, that some grassroots efforts like boycotting incidents will be successful at a local level, but in order to really enforce desegregation on a national level, the government needs to get involved. We see with the Albany movement in Georgia that without federal government involvement, segregation can still triumph. So what we're going to see in Albany, Georgia is that the white mobs and sense of police brutality were actually controlled by local authorities. They tried to quell the violence of the white backlash. And by doing this, they actually were able to pretty heavily arrest black protesters for disturbing the peace because there wasn't a lot of white violence or uproar against the black protesters. It did not amass major political or international attention. And so basically what we see with Albany, Georgia is that since the whites were controlled, the Albany movement for desegregation in that city of Georgia was not particularly successful. Instead, black activists were jailed, and the fact that whites sort of behaved themselves meant that less people paid attention to the story. Even in the Albany movement, Martin Luther King was arrested twice. And after the Albany movement is sort of coming to a close, we see that Albany is still very much segregated. So again, the failure of the Albany movement sort of highlights that there needs to be federal government intervention to make sure that integration takes place. The peak of the civil rights campaign, I would say, would be like, in some ways, 1963, because this is where activism is growing, but there is not yet any major federal accomplishment. We don't yet have any laws on the books. So what we see is that in 1963 or so, the civil rights movement really works to broaden their base of support. And they also start to push for civil rights legislation at the federal level. They realize that, you know, again, the sit-ins and boycotts were successful locally, but their protest at the grassroots level was not enough to end segregation. So they also are really pushing to further expose violence and brutality against the Black community to the international community. So they really want to make sure that people, both in northern cities that tend to be sympathetic to their cause, as well as people internationally, really know about the brutality against African Americans that's taking place so that they also can speak out against it. In conjunction with the Student Christian Leadership Conference, local activists in Birmingham, Alabama start to plan a large desegregation campaign. Alabama is an important state for civil rights because it was in the deep, deep South. It had a pretty high black population compared to the white population, and it had some of the most thorough segregation laws on the books. So that's one of the reasons why Dr. King centered a lot of his protests in Birmingham. These nonviolent protests did result in mass jailing of the protesters. Dr. Martin Luther King was no exception. He also was jailed in Birmingham, and he was sent to solitary confinement. And when he was there, he wrote the letters from the Birmingham jail, which eventually are published. And because of his eloquent writing and because he accurately describes the conditions that he's facing, this, again, exposes a pretty wide audience to the kinds of brutalities that these civil rights activists are facing. And it causes many people to believe that he was jailed unjustly. And so, again, it arouses much more attention towards their struggle. Also, there was a children's march in Birmingham. So basically you had a series of youth that protested in favor of civil rights. And what was really shocking to the public about that was that brutality that adult black protesters experienced was also something that the kids did. So this is sort of a disturbing image to look at, but this is the police actually turning a fire hose, which has a crazy amount of pressure. This is painful. These kids, adolescents, maybe 12, 13, 14 years old, are getting sprayed by a police fire hose because they're peacefully protesting for civil rights. And what's even more devastating was that even after eventually you're going to have a little bit of a truce result in Birmingham. Eventually, the Student Christian Leadership Conference agrees to end the protests, but they want to, in exchange, get desegregation and hiring of African Americans. So once the Birmingham protests start to wind down, we experienced one of the most devastating events in Birmingham, which is where a church was bombed and 4 young black girls were killed. So we see that these are the Birmingham church bombing victims. And we also see that there was KKK activity in the Birmingham area. So even though there were some accomplishments by the Birmingham movement and states seemed to say that they would be moving more towards segregation, this does not change the general attitude. Even if lawmakers grant concessions to the civil rights activists, the general people are voicing their dissatisfaction with desegregation. Again, I think that the March on Washington is sort of the peak of the civil rights movement. First off, we're going to see that this shows us that there is a very large support not only for civil rights, but to make it official, to actually have federal legislation that protects the rights of people regardless of race. So basically what we're going to see is that people are going to start to push President Kennedy to be much more direct in terms of addressing civil rights. Some of the reason why they're pushing for that is because, they feel as though at this point we're getting closer to the Vietnam conflict. Already some soldiers are getting sent over there, and some people are making the argument that if both black and white troops are sent abroad, then they should be acknowledged as equal citizens by the federal government. JFK does announce that he's going to start to push for civil rights legislation. And when he makes that announcement that very same day, the Mississippi NAACP leader, his name was Medgar Evers, was murdered. And so this shows us that immediately when the president says that he supports civil rights, there's going to be backlash and a major civil rights leader is going to be killed. So it really prompts urgency for the civil rights movement. And so this March on Washington in 1963 shows us the large-scale effort to promote civil rights legislation. There were over 200,000 people who attended the march. There were both black and white people. There were more black protesters, but something like 15 to 20,000, so about 10% of the marchers were white. Again, their goal was to pass civil rights legislation, and the event culminated with Martin Luther King delivering his I Have a Dream speech, where he highlights his goal of racial equality, and he also quotes directly from the Declaration of Independence to discuss the idea that ever since the founders, that all men were meant to be created equal. So he sort of is bringing in a sense of continuity for the people, that the government was originally intended to protect them, and ultimately the goal of the civil rights activists was to make this a reality. The next video will start to talk about some of the actual tangible accomplishments that the civil rights